This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me, as always, is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is the podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Dr. Millicent Eidson, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Albany School of Public Health. She teaches at the University of Vermont. She previously worked for the Center of Disease Control and for public health departments in New York. I'm sorry, I said New York. Is that right?
Yeah.
New York and New Mexico. And she's the author of a microbial mystery series featuring her protagonist, Maya McGuire. So welcome to The Right Approach.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's good to see Barbara again. We see each other all the time at Grand Canyon Sisters of Crime, but now I get to meet you as well.
Yeah, so you have gone from New Mexico and the Southwest to very much the northeastern end of the country. That's a pretty big geography difference.
Yeah, I grew up in Arizona, in Tucson, actually, and then worked for about 12 years with the New Mexico Health Department in Santa Fe. And I still have family in Arizona, so I absolutely love the Southwest. It's kind of my heart home. So my novels and a lot of my short stories are set in the Southwest. But yeah, for job reasons, I ended up going to the New York Health Department and then retiring in Burlington, Vermont. So now I'm a Northeasterner.
All right, so you are a veterinarian by training and have done public health work throughout your career and academia as well. So tell me, because I think this is going to, and obviously you write a microbial mystery series. So talk about your training and your background and the focus of the work that you did, and we can talk about how that has affected and contributed to the fiction writing that you do.
Sure. So as you indicated, I went to veterinary school, but actually before that, I was going to graduate school and finished up with a master's degree in social psychology. So I always had a broad interest in social issues, and then went to veterinary school. And in veterinary school, I found out about what we call public practice, which is working for a larger group than just individual clients. And so, of course, epidemiology, that's the science of public health, of looking at diseases in populations. So I actually learned about it and got hooked on it in vet school. So right out of vet school, I went to work for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in a special 2-year training program that they have that's mostly for physicians, but I was fortunate as a veterinarian to get into it. And so my career has been in public health ever since. As we said, working after I did the 2 years with the Centers for Disease Control, then 12 years with New Mexico Health Department and 20 years with New York Health Department. Along the way, I always had academic appointments, so I was always doing teaching too. So the work involved a lot of writing, a lot of academic writing, and writing guidelines and publishing disease studies that I'd done. So I always did that kind of writing. And every now and then I think about or try to do a little creative writing, but just never had time until I retired from full-time public health work. So
can I ask you, so did your epidemiology work for Centers for Disease Control, was that within the human population or within animal, or both?
Right. Yeah. So epidemiology is broad and it doesn't matter. And in fact, everybody doing this work nowadays is embracing what's called One Health, which means we're looking at the integration of health in humans, other living creatures, and the environment. So the skills, the research skills and the disease investigation skills, the medical detective skills are the same regardless. I mean, it's a little more complicated. These diseases that are called zoonoses, that are the ones in common or spread between animals and humans, makes it a little more complicated. But veterinarians are, uniquely trained to look broadly because we start out studying multiple species in veterinary school. So we're pretty valuable. And in fact, my 2-year training assignment with the CDC was at the National Cancer Institute, and it was looking at breast cancer and pancreatic cancer in humans. So my my research design and statistics training that I got in graduate school before vet school, applied to human disease just as well. And a lot of veterinarians, and certainly my career in public health, was not just confined to animal diseases. It was very broad. I in New Mexico, I worked on lead poisoning risk, from lead tailings, and looked at uranium, and so I've studied a lot of issues besides the zoonotic diseases, those from animals.
So one of my neighbors has taken on feeding a horde of feral cats and has recently added to that a mama raccoon. So I'm sure we'll see the babies around soon. Am I going to be ground zero for some pandemic that crosses all human and animal lines soon? Is that
and you're in Alabama, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. It's a risk. The diseases, one of the diseases that we worry about the most, of course, is rabies, because it's got the highest case fatality rate, is the term that we use, which means of the people who get infected with rabies, pretty much 100% of them die. So it's real scary disease. That's going to be probably the R disease, if I recall, in my alphabetical novels. And I'm forgetting now that the kind of rabies that it can be risky in that scenario is raccoon rabies, of course. And raccoon rabies, fortunately, is not throughout the whole country, although any raccoon in any part of the country could get it. But the particular strain that likes to live in raccoons is on the East Coast. And I know they've got it in Florida. I can't remember if it's spread as far as Alabama. I think it might have creeped in there. But yeah, that's what I would worry about.
Oh, good. All right. So you mentioned your alphabetical series. And so with are you planning to go from A through Z? And if so, do you already have them picked out?
I do. I can't necessarily remember them all, but Z, of course, is easy. That's Zika. So yeah, I've got them, and I'm writing now the fourth one, the D one, which is dengue virus.
So go ahead, Barb.
I was just going to say, so how did you come up with this series and this protagonist? Is there a lot of you in the protagonist? Kind of give us the lowdown as to how you did this.
Sure. Well, certainly my career in public health was very exciting, and I just find these diseases fascinating. And so, I decided to write about it for fiction. And of course, these are always, whenever we're starting to investigate a new outbreak, it's mysterious about how it's happening. And so we are acting as disease detectives. So I felt like mystery was a good way to go for these. So there certainly is me in my character in regards to the scientific background, but I decided to have my character being a young person starting out, like, when I first started out in my career, and that, that's really an exciting time in your life when you're learning and you're struggling and you're not sure whether what you're doing is right or whatever. So I thought that I would have my character through the novels, through the A to Z novels, go through, maybe about 20 years of her life, as she develops in the work. And that would be a good chance to show all the different kinds of jobs and different places that you can work doing this too. So in regards to the personal characteristics, I got the idea to have my character be Chinese American because our daughter, we adopted her from China. And so I thought it would be fun to give her a role model. So I set my daughter to be similar. I mean, my character, Maya McGuire, to be similar in age to my own daughter, and kind of inspired by her background as a, feeling like a fish out of water. Being adopted from China and then starting out growing up in the Southwest where there weren't many Asians at all, and so it's kind of a combination. It's in honor of my daughter, but also, of course, based on my own career background.
So you've got 26 books to write. Sounds like you've written 3 and you're working on the 4th one. Do you know, for the ones that are ahead of you, I mean, you've already got the particular disease or that will be involved. Do you know how those stories are going to go, or is it you'll figure it out later. It's not necessary to figure it out right now. Or are there some that you've already got picked out?
Yeah, I'm more of a what we used to call a pantser or seat of the pants writer. Now we're calling a discovery writer. So I like to just sit down. I'll do before I start writing, I'll have all my scientific articles pulled up and I'll have everything ready so that I've refreshed myself on every detail of the disease. But then I'll just sit down with the characters and kind of see where they want to go.
So
Do
I
your
think
plots involve finding out what the disease is and where it came from, or is the disease just part of the background and there's some other mystery crime, something that needs to be solved?
The disease is the skeleton for the story, and so the primary mystery is figuring out where this disease outbreak is happening. So it usually starts with, one, as it does in real life, like with one case. And then, is that tip of the iceberg or is it going to be something bigger? And of course, it ends up being something bigger and trying to figure out what's going on. So I view the disease organism as like the criminal. So in a crime novel, when you're trying to figure out who the criminal is, you're trying to figure out, in these books, you know pretty quickly sometimes which disease it is because the lab techniques that we have these days, you can usually, get that nailed down. But how it's spreading and the different ways that it spreads ends up being the mystery for the rest of the story. But I do also include other mysterious elements of the human characters. Are there any bad guys that are helping out these disease organisms or getting in the way of solving them or whatever? And all the challenges that the characters face in trying to solve it. So they can run up against some humans that don't always do the best thing too. So
your titles, like A is for anthrax, for instance. So the reader picks it up and knowing that we're going to be reading about anthrax. Do you have to draft the interior of your novel a little different because the end, sort of the culprit, the guilty party, is known when they pick up the book? How do you handle that as a writer?
Yeah, what you don't know, the organism, but for instance, the second novel, Borrelia, some people may be familiar with Borrelia because it's the organism that causes Lyme disease, which of course on the East Coast, a lot of people worry about, and in other parts of the country too. So, but particularly in the East Coast. And so someone who, knows that Borrelia stands for Lyme disease may think it's going to be about Lyme disease. But in fact, I actually in that book emphasize the weird kinds of Borrelia that nobody's ever heard of. So I talk a little bit about Lyme disease, but there's all these other kinds of Borrelia, both here and overseas, that are spread both from ticks and from lice. And so, you may have an idea, that it's going to be about Borrelia, maybe Lyme disease, and then you'll find out that it's about so much more.
So I know that your science background, and you talked about having all of your research ready and available to you and preparing yourself. How much of that science makes it into the story itself? We've all read stories by Michael Crichton and folks like that, and there is enough in there, but also not so much that you're bored. And maybe that's not the right word, but that you get bogged down into it. So how do you manage those things?
Right. Yeah, that's a challenge. And also there's a number of ways to go with the science. Like a lot of writers who write these kinds of stories about scary organisms will be more science fiction. So they'll just take off from real life and then they'll create some new mutated organism or something like that. And in a way that might be easier for them, I don't know, because they can do it truly in their own imagination. I instead want to stick to real life. I think real life with these organisms is fascinating enough. And there's enough weird ways that people have never heard of that people get exposed and come down with them that I try to stick really closely to real life. So but it is a huge balancing act between the science and the way public health is done, which I want to share with people. I think it's fascinating. But this is a creative medium, and what we engage in stories through emotions and through characters. And so it's important to me, I love these characters, and so they're real to me, and so it's important that they have really strong emotional lives and their family and their loved ones and friends. And I also have other themes in the stories, like immigration can impact the risk of diseases. Climate change is a huge risk for these diseases. So there's a number of other themes in there, and basically I have to balance all of that. And I'm a huge fan of workshops, writers' workshops. So it takes me a couple years to get one of these novels ready for release, and a lot of that is spent in the workshopping process, where I get feedback from other writers, and they'll tell me, there's too much in the weeds on the science on this part, try to translate it for the public. And so I rely on that a lot.
Yeah, I can really identify with that. So in my fourth novel that came out in May, the character is an insurance coverage lawyer. And while that isn't central to the story, his expertise in contracts is, and it's important. And so I had a chapter early on where I needed to establish his expertise. And so the person that I work with in workshopping mine and who helps me edit it, in the first pass, she was like, this reads like a continuing education seminar. Like, this is not working. I said, okay. So I did a bunch of revisions on it, gave it back to her, and so finished the novel. We're going through like the second and third passes and just cutting and making things as concise as possible while still establishing his expertise in creating, because he was doing kind of this presentation. And then I sent it off to somebody else, and they were like, I get what you're doing here, but like, it still needs something. And so like, I have never worked on a single chapter as much as that one chapter in that, where I had to establish his credentials without boring the audience, especially because it's in the first 10 or 15% of the book, and you're like, I can't give them a reason to put this down now. And so that was a really hard balance to strike, more so in that single instance than anything else that I've ever written. And so I totally understand what you say when you're saying you're workshopping it and people are saying, hey, this, like, I get it, but the average person who's not acquainted with this stuff needs to be able to like understand it, but also be able to move on.
Right. And the biggest challenge was with the third novel, the Corona novel, which will be out by the time this podcast airs. And because we all lived through Corona. And so, we all have our own experiences of it. And so to make it interesting and not just repeat what everybody went through, that was an even bigger challenge. And to have it be, because it was a real outbreak, the other outbreaks are real somewhere in the world, but not necessarily real in the time of the readers. But COVID was, real at the time of the readers. And so that was particularly challenging to have it be accurate. So literally looking day by day over the time period of the novel, which is 2019 to 2021, what was happening day by day, what people were going through, what things were closed, what was the restrictions, all of that, so that I would be accurate. But at the same time, having a lot of the novel be things that people have never heard of. So, a real heavy emphasis on the animal links, and which most people may not have paid much attention to, particularly the disease in mink and the risk that posed to people, the disease in bats, in pets and in wildlife in zoos. Some of that people heard of, but just allowing the readers to kind of see behind the scenes of how you investigate those animal cases and what risk they had for us, and so that it again, the balance between the science and but having it be new and interesting for people who went through the pandemic. So
I wanted to ask you, yeah, you're writing to establish credibility that's heavy lifting. You need to do that for the characters and to set the stage for the reader. You also write short stories, is that right? Within this whole milieu, how do you do that in the space of a short story? And what's your goal with your short stories?
I love short stories. I first had to write the first. So one of the things I've been doing in my retirement is taking college classes in creative writing, and I'm lucky here in Vermont. Senior citizens can take them for free if auditing them. So every semester I'm taking a new class. I always want to be perfecting my craft, and so a number of these college classes require writing a short story for the semester. And so the very first short story I wrote kind of triggered my whole writing the novels. It was a short class, only a month, and I figured I better write about something I know. So I wrote it about a plague outbreak, bubonic plague, which of course in the Southwest is something people are familiar with. And the teacher liked it so much, he said, but this is a big scope. You should really consider making this into novels. So I still thank that teacher for getting me thinking about, turning these into novels. But in these courses, I continue having to write short stories, and they're so challenging. In fact, in some ways, I find them harder because you have to be so succinct. You have to focus just on a small number of characters and a small time period, and it has to be really focused. But I've come to just love them. And in fact, this past winter, I published a collection of my shorter works. All of them I was successful in having published in various online magazines or literary journals. But then I pulled them together in a collection this past winter called Microbial Mysteries, a story collection. And it was so much fun writing them because I could be totally experimental. In my novels, I'm sticking pretty much with the main protagonist, and it's third person, close third person, but third person point of view. In the short stories, I experiment all over the place. So I write some of them first person. The story called Pariah, that's now my current reader magnet. So if someone signs up at my website, they'll get it for free. I wrote it in second person, which I'd never done before. Everybody knows kind of what second person is, but when to really understand second person and how to write it well and its purpose, I didn't really know until I took this course this past winter and then wrote this story Pariah. And so another short story I experimented with is showing the end first and then going backwards in time to the beginning of the story. So you have this mysterious end, and then you want to figure out how did things end up so badly at the end, and you go kind of reverse chronology. So and then in the other thing I do with my short stories, I'll spin off my side characters from the novels, because I love my side characters. There's older people who are mentors to my main character, Maya McGuire. I like to show them at different times of their life, like how their career started. And so the short stories have just been so much fun to do different things. Like I said, be very creative in the writing style, very experimental, and then also explore some of these side characters and earlier time periods too. So a number of them are prequels to the novels.
So we couldn't have planned this conversation any better, because the episode just before this one with Savannah Gilbo is all about point of view and perspective. And basically we almost skipped over second person point of view, because Savannah was like, don't write your novels in second person. And what I like about short stories, and I think a lot of authors is, I've only written a few, but is that ability to experiment with a shorter form. It's shorter both in the time commitment it takes you to write it, but it also gives you a whole different playground of tools that you can work with, because a reader may not be in to something for 300 pages, but 30 or 35, 25 pages, some, like they may check it out. They may stick with you with something. I just really like the idea of using that different form to try out different things.
Especially like the difference between present tense and past tense. I think it's an interesting psychological phenomenon that readers actually find it easier to read stories in past tense, describing what happened. Even if you're describing kind of like what's happening now, just writing it in past tense, it's easier for writers than for readers. And so most novels are written in past tense voice. Um, and they say some are written in present tense, but they say it can be harder for readers over the long form of a novel to read present tense. But again, in a short story, it's really fun and very powerful, and it gives a great punch to write in present tense for a short story. And again, the same thing with second person. I think it might be very challenging to read it for a whole novel, although I seem to recall it. I checked out that somebody's tried it, but for a short story, it can be great. So
Yeah, I was going to say about the present tense versus past tense. I can't remember. I was listening to a podcast about this recently, and now I can't remember where, although that would be really helpful if I did. But, they talked about the reason past tense is more comfortable is because for, you know, thousands and thousands of years of human history, ever since we've been talking to each other, that's how we've been telling stories. And it's just built into our brains that this is how you consume a story, is something that has already happened and is being told to you. But I have used present tense in small doses, um, and it gives something a whole different sense of immediacy, and I feel like I played with it with my fifth novel about whether I wanted to do that or not, and part of it was I don't want the reader to have a sense that everything turns out okay for the protagonist at the end, because at the time I started writing it, I didn't know if it was going to or not. I didn't know who was going to survive the story. And so I thought, if I tell this in the present tense, then they know that the protagonist also doesn't know how this thing's going to come out in the end. And there is no security blanket of knowing that this person is telling you this story later on and that they survived it and that they're fine now, because you were just experiencing it along with them. Um, Ultimately, I didn't do that, but it's something I definitely considered for those reasons. And I think that if it were a shorter form story, that might have been something that I did throughout.
yeah, and then just character point of view, like how often do you change that, and how close are you to the character point of view versus distance, like more omniscient? There's just so many different options that, of course, we can try in our longer books too. But yeah, I really love just being able to experiment in a short story. So
Yeah, I know that for me, it takes about 6 or 7 months generally, or I guess maybe 6 to 9 months to write a novel. And so I am much less inclined for something that's going to take me that long, to experiment in a way that may require wholesale changes later. Whereas, if it's 7,500 words, well, that's a different thing. And
Yeah.
that gives me that freedom to try something new or different.
well, especially if you're a series writer, then your readers have a certain expectation about the style, and it would be jarring to totally uproot that between books. So
Yeah.
Well, let's do this. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And before we wrap it up, please tell people where they can find you. I know you've got your website there. For those who are watching, you've got your website there beside your name, but tell people what social media you use, where your website is, and where they can buy your books.
sure. My website is named after my main protagonist, Dr. Maya McGuire. So it's all no periods or anything in there, just DRMAYA. McGuire is MAGUIRE. So drmayamcguire.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and it just depends on which one it is. It's either under my name, Millicent Eidson, or under Dr. McGuire, Maya McGuire. But if you just go and search for me on those different social media, you'll be able to find it.
And where
Well,
can we
thank you.
find your books? Wait a minute, got a plug where we can
Yeah,
find your
yeah.
books. And what's the name of your one that's just coming out?
Corona, the C one is the one coming out now, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I deliberately publish wide. I have my own publishing company, Maya McGuire Media. I love having control over the process and being able to obsess over the process and make my books as perfect as I can. So I don't like deadlines. So with my own publishing company, I can do that. And so they're published wide, which means that you can certainly get them all in all formats. So I've done ebook, paperback, hardcover, and for the first two novels, I did large print as well, although people don't seem as interested in those anymore because nowadays you can get the large print through the ebook. So so I do multiple formats for people. I'm actually recording the audiobook now for my short stories. That'll be my first audiobook. So those will all are available on Amazon, but you can also go anywhere else to get them too. So I publish through Ingram, which then gets it to bookstores and libraries. I publish through Draft to Digital, which gets it to everybody else, all the other stores. So I do use a universal link, Books to Read, which some people may be familiar with, just books and the number 2 read and then my name. And that pulls up all the links, but also my website will give all the links too. So,
all right, we'll include your website in the show notes, and from there, everybody will be able to find all the other things. So, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.